Ethan Blake stood at the airport, his polished shoes tapping impatiently against the tiled floor as he checked his watch for the third time. Despite the wealth that surrounded him, the opulence of his finely tailored suit, the diamond-encrusted watch, and the aura of power that exuded from him, he couldn't shake an unsettling feeling. He was about to board yet another first-class flight, heading to yet another high-profile business meeting, the kind that had become routine in his life. These moments, once thrilling and full of promise, had become increasingly hollow, a ritual of maintaining the empire he had built from nothing. As he absent-mindedly scanned the bustling crowd around him, something caught his eye. It was just a flash at first, a woman's silhouette, her hair cascading down her back in a way that felt hauntingly familiar. He blinked, trying to shake the illusion, but there she was again, standing near the departure gate. Next to her was a young boy, perhaps around 10 years old, tugging on her hand and chattering excitedly. The sight stopped Ethan in his tracks. It was as if time had slowed and all the noise around him faded into a distant hum. He felt his breath hitch, his heart pounding wildly in his chest as he squinted to get a better look. Could it be? No, it wasn't possible. But it was her, Lily. The woman he had left behind all those years ago, the woman he had once promised to love forever. Ethan's mind spun, reeling from the shock of seeing her after so many years. He had convinced himself he would never encounter her again, that she was a part of a past he had buried beneath layers of luxury and success. And yet here she was, standing just a few feet away, completely unaware of his presence. His eyes drifted to the boy, and a strange feeling washed over him, one that he couldn't quite identify. It was an unsettling mix of curiosity, longing, and fear. The boy's hair was dark, wild, and unruly, much like Ethan's had been when he was a child. And then there were his eyes, bright blue, piercing, almost identical to Ethan's own. The realization hit him like a freight train, knocking the wind out of him. Could this child be his son? The thought was absurd, impossible, and yet as he continued to stare, the resemblance became undeniable. Ethan's pulse quickened, his chest tightening with a sense of panic. He took a step forward, compelled to move closer, to somehow bridge the gap between them, but his feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. Lily still hadn't noticed him. She was fully focused on the boy, smiling as she responded to his excited chatter. It was a smile Ethan hadn't seen in years, a genuine warmth that made her eyes sparkle. And as he stood there, frozen, memories he had tried so hard to suppress began flooding back. The nights they spent talking about their dreams, the laughter they shared over simple dinners, the way she would look at him as if he were the only person in the world. He had abandoned all of that, walked away from her, convinced that he needed more. Now, as he watched her interact with this boy who might be his son, he was overcome with an emotion he hadn't felt in years: regret. The boy glanced up, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Ethan felt an electric jolt shoot through him, as if the boy could somehow sense the connection between them. It took every ounce of strength Ethan had to tear his gaze away, to stop himself from rushing over and demanding answers. Instead, he turned on his heel, his mind racing. He needed to know the truth, and he would do whatever it took to find out. Years earlier, Ethan Blake had been a man filled with dreams and ambition, but weighed down by the harsh realities of life. He and Lily had lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood, scraping by on the meager salary he earned as a struggling entrepreneur. Despite their financial troubles, those early years had been some of the happiest in his life. There was a simplicity to their existence, a purity that came from facing hardships together. Every challenge had brought them closer, and every small victory felt monumental. They didn't need much, just each other, and the hope that someday things would get better. But as time passed, Ethan grew restless. The vision of a better life, of wealth and success, began to consume him. He wanted more than just enough to get by. He wanted to break free from the shackles of poverty that had defined his entire upbringing. And as his aspirations grew, so did his frustration with the life he shared with Lily. He began to see their small apartment not as a home, but as a cage, a constant reminder of his failures. One evening, after yet another failed business deal, Ethan came home in a rage. He slammed the door behind him, startling Lily, who had been waiting up for him with a warm meal. "How was it?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. "I'm tired, Lily," he snapped, brushing past her without another word. "Tired of pretending that things are going to get better." Lily followed him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "Ethan, we'll figure it out. We always do." But her words felt like salt in a wound, and Ethan pulled away. "No, you don't understand. We're not going to figure it out. This isn't working. I'm not working. I'm nothing." "That's not true," Lily insisted, her voice trembling. "You are everything to me." But in that moment, Ethan couldn't hear her. All he saw was his own reflection, distorted and twisted by years of unfulfilled dreams. He felt trapped, suffocated, and in his desperation to escape, he pushed away the one person who believed in him. That night after their fight, he wandered into a high-end bar, a place he couldn't afford but desperately wanted to be a part of. It was there that he met Sophia, a woman who seemed to have everything Ethan had ever wanted. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and already deeply entrenched in the world of wealth and luxury that Ethan craved. Sophia was different. She offered him a taste of the life he had always dreamed about, a life that promised success, power, and most importantly, an escape from the mediocrity that had come to define his existence. She promised to help him make connections, to introduce him to people who could change his life. And Ethan, blinded by his ambitions, made a choice that would change everything. He left Lily, convinced that she was the anchor holding him back from greatness. The years that followed should have been everything Ethan ever dreamed of. He quickly climbed the ranks of the business world, thanks in no small part to Sophia's influence and connections. They got married in an extravagant ceremony, the kind he had once fantasized about when he had nothing. They lived in a mansion overlooking the city, attended exclusive parties, and traveled the world. To outsiders, it appeared as though Ethan had it all: the wealth, the power, the respect. But beneath the surface, something was missing. No matter how much he acquired, Ethan couldn't shake the gnawing sense of emptiness that followed him everywhere he went. He and Sophia didn't share the same kind of connection he had once had with Lily. Their conversations were shallow, their relationship a business transaction more than a partnership. And as the years passed, the thrill of success dulled, replaced by a hollow ache that grew stronger with each passing day. Ethan buried himself in work, hoping to drown out the discontent that whispered in the back of his mind. But no matter how many deals he closed, no matter how many accolades he received, he couldn't escape the feeling that something vital was missing from his life. He thought about Lily more often than he cared to admit, wondered where she was, if she had moved on, if she ever thought about him. But every time those thoughts surfaced, he pushed them down, convincing himself that he had made the right choice, that he had done what was necessary to achieve his dreams. Then, in that single moment at the airport, everything he had buried for so long came rushing back to the surface, threatening to unravel the life he had built. For the first time in years, Ethan couldn't ignore the voice inside him that whispered he had made a terrible mistake. Ethan needed answers, and he needed them fast. He couldn't bear the uncertainty, the not knowing if that boy was his son. Desperation gnawed at him, so he reached out to Marcus, an old friend who had become a private investigator. Marcus had always been the guy to turn to when you needed to get things done quietly and efficiently. Ethan trusted him, even though they hadn't spoken in years. "Find out everything you can about Lily Hayes," Ethan said, his voice tense as he handed Marcus a photo of her. "And the boy with her. I need to know if he's mine." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but he didn't ask questions. "You got it, Ethan. I'll be in touch." The next few days were torture for Ethan. He threw himself into work, attending meetings, negotiating deals, but his mind was always elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Lily, about the life they might have had if he hadn't walked away. And every time he thought about that boy, about Lucas, his heart ached with a longing he couldn't quite understand. Finally, Marcus called. "Ethan, I've got the information you asked for. We need to talk." Ethan rushed to meet him, his heart pounding in his chest. As Marcus handed over the file, Ethan felt his hands trembling. He opened it slowly, almost afraid of what he might find. "She was pregnant when you left," Marcus said quietly. "She had the baby on her own. His name is Lucas. He's your son." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the photographs inside the file. There was Lily, looking tired but proud, holding a tiny baby swaddled in a blanket. And there were more photos. Lucas at different ages, smiling, playing, growing up without a father. Each image felt like a punch to Ethan's gut, a reminder of everything he had missed, everything he had walked away from. "She's done a good job," Marcus continued. "She's a teacher now, put herself through night school while raising him. It hasn't been easy, but she's made a life for them. Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from the pictures. Tears blurred his vision as he took in the evidence of a life that had continued without him. And as the weight of his choices settled on his shoulders, he felt something break inside him. He had spent years chasing after wealth and power, convinced that they were the key to happiness. But now, looking at the faces of the family he had abandoned, Ethan realized that he had lost something far more valuable. For the first time in a decade, he felt the full impact of his choices, and he knew, without a doubt, that he had to make things right. Ethan couldn't stay away. He tried to convince himself that it was better to leave things as they were, that he had no right to barge back into Lily's life after all these years. But the thought of Lucas, his son, kept gnawing at him, a constant reminder of the life he had abandoned. Every day he woke up with a sense of longing that grew more unbearable, and every night he was haunted by dreams of what could have been. He had to see them again, had to find some way to connect with his son, even if it meant facing Lily's wrath. He tracked her down to the modest neighborhood where she lived, a far cry from the luxury he was accustomed to. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he parked his sleek black car across the street from the small house. It was the kind of place he had once envisioned for them, a cozy home with a garden where they would raise their children together. But he had traded that dream for something bigger, something shinier, and now, as he stood there staring at the life he could have had, he felt a crushing sense of regret. He watched from a distance as Lily stepped out onto the porch, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, wearing a faded sundress that fluttered in the breeze. Lucas ran out after her, laughing as he chased a stray cat down the driveway. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There was so much life, so much joy in that little scene, and for a moment, he felt like an outsider peering into a world that wasn't his to claim. He took a deep breath, steeling himself before stepping out of his car. As he crossed the street, Lily looked up, her eyes narrowing in confusion. She blinked, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. It wasn't until he was standing just a few feet away that recognition flashed in her eyes, followed by something else, something darker. "Ethan," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hadn't thought about what he would say, hadn't prepared for this moment at all. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice sounding strange and foreign to his own ears. I saw you at the airport." Lily's expression hardened, and she crossed her arms over her chest, a barrier between them. "That was over a week ago. What do you want?" I needed to know if he was mine," Ethan said, gesturing toward Lucas, who had stopped running and was now watching them with curious eyes. "I needed to know the truth." The air between them crackled with tension, and for a moment Ethan thought she might scream at him, tell him to leave and never come back. Instead, Lily let out a long, weary sigh. "Yes, Ethan. He's your son. But you already knew that, didn't you? Otherwise you wouldn't be here." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, the reality of her words hitting him with full force. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lily's eyes flashed with anger. "Why would I? You made your choice. You walked away without a second thought. You didn't want this life, Ethan. You didn't want us." "I was wrong," he whispered, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. How could he possibly explain the depths of his regret? The years he had spent convincing himself that he had made the right decision. "I was scared and I thought I needed more." "And now?" Lily challenged, her gaze never wavering. "What do you think you need now?" "Now I just want to be a part of his life," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "Please, Lily. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to make things right. I need to make things right." Lily stared at him for what felt like an eternity, and Ethan could see the battle raging behind her eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice laced with a sadness that cut through him like a knife. "You don't get to just walk back into our lives and pretend that everything is okay, Ethan. You left us. You left me when I needed you the most. You don't get to come back now and act like nothing happened." "I know," Ethan said, tears welling up in his eyes. "I know I can't undo what I did, but please, give me a chance to try, just to be there for him." Lily shook her head, her expression softening just a fraction. "It's not that simple, Ethan. He doesn't even know you. To him, you're just a stranger." The weight of her words settled on Ethan's shoulders, but instead of pushing him away, it only made him more determined. "Then let me introduce myself," he said. "Let me earn the right to be his father." Lily studied him for a moment, and he could see the doubt, the fear, and the tiny spark of hope that flickered in her eyes. "You can meet him," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But don't you dare hurt him. Don't you dare hurt him the way you hurt me." Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I promise." Sophia had always prided herself on her ability to read people. She knew Ethan better than anyone, knew every facet of his ambition, his desires, and his weaknesses. So when he began to act differently, distant, preoccupied, she noticed immediately. At first she chalked it up to stress from work, another big deal in the making. But when she caught him staring at an old photo of a woman she didn't recognize, she knew something had changed. It didn't take long for Sophia to piece together the puzzle. Ethan was spending more time out of the house, taking phone calls late at night, and talking in hushed tones when he thought she wasn't listening. He became withdrawn, his eyes clouded with a sadness she had never seen before. And that's when she realized he was slipping away from her. Sophia couldn't let that happen. She had invested too much in him, molded him into the man she wanted him to be. She wasn't about to let some ghost from his past jeopardize everything they had built. So, she did what she always did best. She dug deeper. It wasn't difficult to find out about Lily. Sophia had connections, and it didn't take long to track down the details of Ethan's former life, the life he had so carefully hidden from her. As she read the reports on Lily and Lucas, her anger began to boil. How dare he? How dare he try to rewrite history, to go back to the life he had abandoned? Driven by a mix of jealousy and fear, Sophia decided to tighten her grip on Ethan. She began investigating his past business deals, digging up dirt that she could use against him if necessary. It wasn't long before she found exactly what she was looking for: evidence of shady dealings, fraudulent contracts, and financial missteps from Ethan's early years. It was enough to ruin him, enough to bring his entire empire crashing down. And that's exactly what she did. Sophia leaked the information anonymously to the press, watching with a perverse sense of satisfaction as the scandal erupted. Within days, Ethan's name was splashed across every newspaper and website, his reputation in tatters. The media hounded him relentlessly. Investors pulled out and board members turned against him. Everything he had worked so hard for was crumbling, slipping through his fingers like sand. Ethan woke up one morning to find his face plastered across the television screen, headlines screaming accusations of fraud and embezzlement. He felt his world collapse around him, the empire he had built reduced to rubble in an instant. He sat in his empty office, staring at the papers strewn across his desk, the weight of his choices finally crashing down on him. For hours he sat there, paralyzed by the enormity of his downfall. But amid the chaos, something shifted within him. As he thought about Lily, about Lucas, he realized that this might be his only chance to start over, to finally confront the man he had become. So instead of hiding, instead of trying to fight the allegations, Ethan did something he had never done before. He told the truth. He called a press conference, stood before a room full of reporters, and confessed to everything. He admitted to the fraudulent deals, the shortcuts, the lies he had told to get ahead. He took full responsibility for his actions, for the choices that had led him down this path, and vowed to face whatever consequences lay ahead. As the cameras flashed and journalists scribbled down his every word, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He wasn't hiding behind wealth or power or status. He was just a man, standing in front of the world, ready to face the consequences of his actions. And in that moment, he felt free. But as he walked away from the podium, he knew there was one more battle he had to fight, the battle for his son's forgiveness. Lily had seen the news reports, the articles detailing Ethan's downfall, and part of her felt a grim sense of satisfaction. It seemed like karma had finally caught up with him, and for a brief moment, she thought that maybe he was getting what he deserved. But as the days passed, that satisfaction turned to something else, something she didn't want to acknowledge: pity. She had loved Ethan once with a depth and intensity that still scared her. Seeing him brought to his knees, stripped of everything he had worked for, stirred emotions she thought she had buried long ago. But it wasn't just about her, it was about Lucas. How could she explain to her son that the man who had abandoned them was now the subject of a national scandal? One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Lucas looked up from his homework, his eyes filled with questions. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "is it true, what they're saying about him?" Lily's heart clenched. She knew this day would come, but she wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt. "Yes," she said quietly. "It's true. Ethan made some bad choices, but that doesn't mean he's a bad person." Lucas frowned, his young face etched with confusion. "Why did he leave us? Why didn't he stay?" Lily took a deep breath, reaching across the table to take her son's hand. "I wish I had all the answers, honey. Sometimes people make mistakes, big mistakes, because they're scared or they think they need something more, but that doesn't mean they can't change." "Do you think he'll change?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lily felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back, forcing herself to smile. "I think he's trying, sweetheart, I really do." And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, people could change. Ethan had never been more terrified in his life. The confession, the public admission of his wrongdoings, had taken every ounce of courage he had, but it was nothing compared to what lay ahead. The real battle, the one that truly mattered, was just beginning. He had faced the consequences of his choices in the business world, but now he had to confront the personal fallout, the son who had grown up without him, and the woman he had betrayed so many years ago. For days, Ethan tried to reach out to Lily, leaving her messages, emails, and even a handwritten letter delivered to her doorstep. But she didn't respond. He couldn't blame her. He had turned her life upside down once, and now he was doing it all over again. But he refused to give up. He would wait for as long as it took, stand outside her house every day if he had to, just for the chance to explain, to ask for her forgiveness. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when he finally saw her again. She was picking Lucas up from school, her hair pulled back, wearing a simple raincoat. Ethan sat in his car, watching them from a distance, trying to summon the courage to approach. As he saw Lucas's face light up when he spotted his mother, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of loss. How many moments like this had he missed? How many times had Lucas looked for his father and found no one there? He stepped out of the car, his heart pounding in his ears as he crossed the street. Lily looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, Ethan saw something flicker in her gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the faintest hint of the love they once shared. But just as quickly, her expression hardened. "Why are you here, Ethan?" she asked, her voice cold but not unkind. "Haven't you done enough?" Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, struggling to find his voice. "I need to talk to him," he said, gesturing toward Lucas, who was watching them with wide eyes. "Please, Lily, I just need to talk to my son." "He doesn't know you," Lily replied, shaking her head. "You're a stranger to him." "I want to change that," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I want to try. Please, let me try." Lily sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. "He's old enough to decide for himself," she said finally, turning to Lucas. "Sweetheart, this is your father." Lucas stared at Ethan, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer. "You're the one on TV," he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "The one who messed up." Ethan nodded, his heart breaking at the boy's bluntness. "Yes," he admitted, "I'm the one who messed up. I made a lot of mistakes, Lucas, but the biggest mistake I ever made was not being there for you." Lucas looked at him for a long time, his eyes searching Ethan's face as if trying to find some trace of himself in this stranger. "Why now?" he finally asked, his voice small. "Why do you want to be here now?" "Because I've realized what's really important," Ethan said, kneeling down to be at eye level with his son. "And that's you. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." Lucas didn't respond right away. He glanced up at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then back at Ethan. "I'll think about it," he said finally, before turning and walking toward the car, leaving Ethan standing there in the rain. Lily watched him for a moment before speaking again. "You've got a long way to go, Ethan," she said quietly. "He's not going to forgive you overnight." "I know," Ethan replied, wiping the rain from his eyes. "But I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed were some of the most challenging of Ethan's life. He started showing up to Lucas's soccer practices, standing at the edge of the field, watching from a distance. He didn't try to force himself into Lucas's life, didn't push for answers or acceptance. He was just there, every single time, hoping that his presence would be enough to prove that he was serious about being a father. At first, Lucas barely acknowledged him. He would glance in Ethan's direction, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his teammates. But gradually, as the days turned into weeks, something began to change. One afternoon, after an especially good practice, Lucas jogged over to where Ethan was standing. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You used to play soccer?" Lucas asked, his tone casual but curious. Ethan smiled, relieved by the small crack in the wall between them. "Yeah, I did," he replied. "I was a striker. Not as good as you, though." Lucas's eyes lit up, and for the first time Ethan saw a hint of pride on his son's face. "Maybe you could show me some moves sometime," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'd like that," Ethan said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'd like that a lot." From that moment on, Lucas began to let Ethan in, little by little. They started kicking the ball around together after practice, and Ethan found himself laughing in a way he hadn't in years. He saw the joy in Lucas's eyes, the unguarded excitement, and it made every sacrifice, every moment of regret, worth it. But he also knew that the path to redemption was far from over. Meanwhile, Sophia was not finished. She had been watching from the shadows, seething with rage, as Ethan began to rebuild the bridges he had burned. She couldn't stand the thought of him finding happiness without her, of him moving on to a life that didn't include her. In a desperate attempt to regain control, she reached out to her contacts in the media, feeding them more information about Ethan's past, trying to keep the scandal alive, to drag him back down into the mud. But this time, Ethan didn't react. He didn't fight back, didn't try to defend himself. He had already faced his demons, and he refused to let Sophia's bitterness drag him back into the darkness. It was a move that both baffled and infuriated her, and in her frustration, she made one final desperate attempt to confront him. She showed up at one of Lucas's soccer games, her eyes wild with anger, and marched straight up to Ethan. "You're not going to win," she hissed, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You don't deserve this. You'll never be good enough for them." Ethan looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time he saw the fear behind her eyes, the desperation that drove her actions. "You're right," he said calmly. "I don't deserve it, but I'm going to keep trying to be better anyway." Sophia stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then without another word she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there with his son by his side. It was only a matter of time before Ethan found himself standing in a courtroom, facing the consequences of his past. The room buzzed with murmurs as the judge prepared to hand down his sentence, and Ethan felt the weight of every decision, every mistake pressing down on him. He had always known this day would come, but he had never imagined he would face it with so much to lose. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Lily sitting in the back row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Lucas was beside her, his eyes wide and anxious, and Ethan felt his heart clench. He had come so far, and now he was about to be torn away from the life he was just beginning to rebuild. "Mr. Blake," the judge said, her voice echoing through the chamber, "you have been found guilty of multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying financial documents. However, due to your cooperation with the authorities and your public confession, this court has decided to show leniency. You are hereby sentenced to 3 years in a state correctional facility, with the possibility of parole after 2 years for good behavior." A collective gasp rippled through the room, but Ethan barely heard it. He turned to look at Lily, and for a brief, agonizing moment, their eyes met. There was sadness there, yes, but there was also something else, something that gave him hope, and as he was led away, Ethan held on to that hope with every ounce of strength he had left. Prison was a stark, brutal contrast to the life Ethan had known, and the adjustment was more difficult than he could have imagined. The days stretched into endless hours, each one bleeding into the next, and there were moments when the isolation, the monotony, threatened to break him. But instead of succumbing to despair, Ethan found solace in the one thing that had always eluded him: honesty. He began to write, filling page after page with his thoughts, his regrets, his hopes for the future. He wrote letters to Lucas, pouring out everything he wished he could say in person, and every week, without fail, he received a reply. They were simple letters filled with updates about soccer games and school projects, but to Ethan, they were lifelines, the threads that kept him connected to the outside world. He took up a job in the prison workshop, learning to use his hands to fix broken furniture, to create something out of nothing. It was hard, grueling work, but it gave him a sense of purpose, a feeling of accomplishment that he hadn't experienced in years. And as the months passed, Ethan found that he was no longer defined by his mistakes. He was becoming something more. When the day of his parole hearing finally arrived, Ethan stood before the board, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. He had worked hard, proven that he was willing to change, and as the board announced their decision, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He was free. Walking out of the prison gates, Ethan took a deep breath, savoring the cool air against his skin. He knew that his journey was far from over, but as he stepped into the waiting arms of his son, as Lily stood just a few feet away with a small, hopeful smile, he knew that he was finally on the path to redemption. The man he had been was gone, and in his place was someone who was ready to fight for the life he truly wanted, the life that had been waiting for him all along. Ethan Blake had been free for several months, but the journey to rebuilding his life had only just begun. He found a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the luxurious penthouses he once called home, but it suited him. It was a place where he could start over, where he could build a life from the ground up without the trappings of wealth and status that had once defined him. He spent his days working at a local hardware store, stocking shelves and helping customers find the right tools. It was honest, hard work, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was earning his keep. But the most important part of his life was Lucas. Every spare moment Ethan had was spent trying to strengthen his bond with his son. They fell into a routine. Ethan would pick him up from soccer practice every Tuesday and Thursday, and they would spend the afternoons together. Sometimes they'd grab ice cream. Other times they'd kick a ball around at the park. And every once in a while, they'd sit in Ethan's tiny living room, playing video games or working on a puzzle. Each moment felt like a gift, a chance to reclaim the years they had lost. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench after an intense game of one-on-one soccer, Lucas turned to Ethan with a question that caught him off guard. "Dad, why did you leave us? Why did you choose to go?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was the question he had been dreading, the one he knew he would eventually have to face. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I was scared, Lucas," he began, his voice trembling. "I was afraid that I wasn't good enough, that I couldn't give your mom the life she deserved. I thought that if I walked away, I could find something better, something bigger. But I was wrong, so terribly wrong." Lucas stared at him, his eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond his years. "Mom always said you were scared," he said quietly. "She said you thought you needed to prove something to yourself." Ethan nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "She's right. I spent so many years chasing after things that didn't matter, trying to prove that I was worthy of I don't even know what. And in doing that, I lost the most important things in my life. I lost you." There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of birds chirping in the distance. Finally, Lucas spoke, his voice steady and clear. "I'm glad you came back, Dad." Ethan felt his heart swell with emotion, and he pulled Lucas into a tight hug. "I'm glad I came back too, buddy," he whispered. "I'm never going to leave you again. I promise." As the months passed, Ethan continued to build his relationship with Lucas, but he also knew there was another person he needed to make amends with: Lily. He saw her often, at soccer games and school events, and while their interactions were polite, there was still a wall between them, a barrier of pain and betrayal that neither of them knew how to dismantle. One evening after Lucas's soccer practice, Ethan finally gathered the courage to approach her. "Lily," he called out as she was packing up the car, "can we talk?" She looked up, her expression guarded, but she didn't turn away. "What is it, Ethan?" I wanted to thank you," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets, "for giving me this chance with Lucas. I know I don't deserve it, but it means more to me than you'll ever know." Lily sighed, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "I didn't do it for you, Ethan. I did it for him. He deserves to have a father." "I know," Ethan said softly, "but you didn't have to let me in. You could have made it so much harder, and you didn't. And for that, I'm grateful." There was a long pause, and then Lily took a step closer. "You've changed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not the same man who walked out on us all those years ago." "No, I'm not," Ethan agreed, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm trying to be better, to be the man you always believed I could be." Lily's eyes softened, and for the first time in years Ethan saw a glimmer of the love they had once shared. "Maybe," she said quietly, "maybe we could try to be friends. For Lucas." Ethan nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that a lot." From that day on, Ethan and Lily began to build a new kind of relationship. It wasn't the romance they had once shared, but it was something real, something built on mutual respect and the shared love they had for their son. They started to spend more time together as a family, weekend barbecues, trips to the beach, movie nights at Lily's house. And slowly, bit by bit, the walls between them began to crumble. Andrew, Lily's fiancé, had been an unwavering presence throughout it all. He had been there for Lily and Lucas when Ethan wasn't, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt every time he saw them together. But Andrew was nothing but kind, always extending a hand of friendship, always willing to let Ethan be a part of Lucas's life. One evening, as they sat around the fire pit in Lily's backyard, Andrew pulled Ethan aside. "You know," he said, staring into the flames, "I never thought I'd be able to share Lucas with you, but I see how much you care about him, and I see how hard you're trying, and I respect that." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "That means more to me than you know." "You're a good man, Ethan," Andrew replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "You just took a little longer to figure it out." Ethan laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Yeah," he said, shaking his head. "I guess I did." One summer afternoon, as they all sat together in the backyard, Lily, Andrew, Lucas, and Ethan realized something that took his breath away. This was what he had always wanted. It wasn't the mansions or the fancy cars, the parties or the endless parade of accolades. It was this: the laughter of his son, the warmth of Lily's smile, the feeling of belonging to something bigger than himself. And in that moment, he knew he had finally found his way home. Years continued to pass, and as Lucas grew taller, stronger, and more confident, Ethan's pride in his son only deepened. He never missed a soccer game, never turned down the opportunity to help with a science project or listen to a story about school. He was there for every scraped knee, every triumph, every heartache, and every small, everyday moment that made life so precious. One evening, as Lucas prepared to leave for his first high school dance, Ethan watched from the doorway, feeling an odd mixture of joy and sadness. Lucas had grown into a young man right before his eyes, and while Ethan was proud beyond words, he couldn't help but feel the weight of all the moments he had missed. "Dad," Lucas called, interrupting his thoughts. "You okay?" Ethan blinked, smiling as he stepped forward. "Yeah, I'm okay," he said, adjusting Lucas's tie with a tenderness that brought tears to his eyes. "I'm more than okay." Lucas looked up at him, his expression serious. "I'm glad you came back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm really glad." Ethan pulled him into a hug, holding him close. "Me too, buddy," he whispered. "Me too." After Lucas left for the dance, Ethan found himself wandering into the kitchen where Lily was cleaning up from dinner. She looked up, smiling as she saw him. "You did good tonight," she said, her voice warm. "Thanks," Ethan replied, leaning against the counter. "I still can't believe how fast he's growing up." "Time has a way of slipping through our fingers," Lily said, her gaze distant. "But you've made the most of the time you've been given." "Only because you let me," Ethan said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Lily, for everything." She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You've earned it," she said softly. "You really have." Ethan squeezed her hand, and for a moment, they stood there, connected by a bond that transcended time, pain, and regret. It wasn't the life they had once imagined, but it was real, and it was theirs. And in that moment, Ethan knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. The journey wasn't over, and there would still be challenges, still moments of doubt and fear. But as long as he had his family by his side, As long as he continued to fight for the life he had rebuilt, Ethan knew he would be just fine, and that he realized was all he had ever truly needed.